Good evening, everybody. We're going to get started. We might have some scragglers come in late, so just be mindful of that. Just want to say thank you so much for coming. We're very excited about this event. We had a really tremendous response, and we're videotaping it because we've had such great response. We have people literally from all over the world, and I say that seriously, who want to hear what this great panel has to say. My name's Mark Randall. I am principal of World Studio and chair of Impact Design for Social Change here at the School of Visual Arts. What was I going to say? Oh, I remember what I was going to say. Okay, so this event is being brought to you by Design Ignites Change, which is an initiative of World Studio and the School of Visual Arts. The summer impact programs here at the School of Visual Arts are now moving into their 6th season. We attract students from all over the world who come to study how they can use design and creativity to impact positive social change. So this event is a really great extension of that program. Tonight's panel is kind of connected to a larger initiative called Mapping Impact. And our moderators this evening, Gilad Marone and Ansley Whipple, are on the organizing committee for this really terrific initiative. So Gilad Marone is a designer, a researcher, and a writer who works with a number of organizations, including the Autodesk Foundation, Enterprise Community Partners, and the Association for Community Design. Ansley Whipple is a great cohort, and we work together at World Studio. She's World Studio's programs director and runs the Design Ignites Change initiative that we have. The Mapping Impact team has been working on this initiative for several months. This is the first of what we hope to be many initiatives around this theme. So I'm going to now stop rambling and turn it over to our moderators to let the show begin.
Thank you, Mark, and welcome everybody. This is an amazing group of people. So just to give some background, over the past 10 to 15 years, there has been a lot of funding and resources devoted to community-based design work. At the same time, we've seen new education programs emerge around the country, such as the Design for Social Innovation program here at SVA. Also, there has been a slew of conferences, events, publications, and exhibitions that highlight this type of work, as well as the emergence of numerous firms and nonprofits practicing in this space. Today, many designers do great work that is creating social impact, but most struggle to provide real evidence for what that impact is or how their designs affect the communities they work with. This is not just a struggle for designers. This is also a major question for funders of this work, as well as students who want to enter this field. But most importantly, this is a real issue for the communities and stakeholders themselves, who have the most to lose in this equation. This boils down to a simple question: how do we know if what we're doing is working? This question is at the core of our research project, and the answer is impact assessment. Impact assessment is a process by which we can work to determine or assess what effects, outcomes, and impacts our work is having. Within the field of social impact design, this means understanding both quantitatively and qualitatively how a community, population, or neighborhood is affected by the actions and interventions of designers and their colleagues. Incorporating impact assessment more rigorously into the design process not only has the potential to strengthen best practices and lead this field towards new insights, but can help us avoid mistakes and failures. While we are not questioning the power design can have to improve the quality of life for many people, too often we've seen misguided projects attempt to help a community in need, only to find that days, months, or years later, the interventions designers implemented actually did more harm than good. We must, at all costs, avoid mistakes such as these that are based in the designer's subjective approach to solving real-world problems, no matter how good their intentions might be. As Ivan Illich once famously said, "To hell with good intentions." Impact assessment points us in a direction away from these failures towards a more evidence-based practice rooted in a deep understanding of the communities we work with. Now, to be sure, we as designers are not pioneers in this area. Impact assessment has been a core part of numerous disciplines for many decades. In particular, fields such as public health, international development, impact investing, economics, and public policy, just to name a few. We as designers are late in the game, and we need to catch up. We can learn from these other disciplines in order to develop legitimate approaches to impact assessment, and also collaborate with fields such as anthropology, environmental psychology, and social work, which play a key role in understanding impact assessment. We hope these conversations continue, and we hope what we discuss here tonight can help build a greater discourse in the design field at large about the importance of impact assessment. Tonight, you might come away with more questions than answers, which is okay because at this stage, we really want to emphasize the importance of asking the right questions. This event is part of an ongoing research initiative to identify and compile toolkits, metrics, best practices, and case studies that can help inform these discussions. This project, which is called Mapping Impact, aims to help build the field of social impact design by connecting design practitioners, students, and researchers with useful tools and resources to better assess the impacts of their work. Please check out our website for more information and news, and we will also be posting a video recording of this event tonight that can be shared easily. I'd like to thank the Impact Design for Social Change program and Design Ignites Change for supporting this event. I would also like to thank our other team members, Katie Crepeau and Kylie Arroyo. Additionally, thanks to our advisors and organizational partners that have helped move this project forward. And now I'm going to let Glad introduce the panelists.
Thank you. So we've brought together three amazing panelists from three different fields, and they're going to each share with us their approach to impact assessment and how impact assessment is incorporated into their work and what we can learn from that. So each panelist is going to come up and give a short introduction to their work and their process, and following that we'll have a conversation, and then at the end we'll have some time for questions and answers from the audience. I'd like to introduce our three panelists and ask them each to come up and speak. But before I do, I just want to apologize. Our fourth panelist, which we had listed, Robert Fabricant, was not able to make it tonight. He unfortunately had an unexpected work assignment in Nigeria and had to leave immediately. But that being said, we still have three amazing panelists. So our first panelist, Rachel Danifer, conducts evaluation and research related to food and nutrition at the New York City Health Department's Bureau of Chronic Disease Prevention and Tobacco Control. This agency and bureau are noted as being amongst the premier sources of both innovative and evidence-based public health policy and programs to improve the environment in which New Yorkers live. Rachel's conducted a range of research projects designed to understand the food environment and has led several evaluations to assess the effectiveness of programs to improve access to healthy foods and provide nutrition education to low-income New Yorkers. Please join me in welcoming Rachel.
So thanks so much for that introduction. And I thought first, since I'm coming from the public health world, which sort of feels like a different universe from the design world, I would just spend a minute talking about the New York City Health Department. So the Health Department is actually a really huge agency. Around 5,000 people work there. And I'm in the Bureau of Chronic Disease Prevention and Tobacco Control. And this bureau focuses on developing policies and programs related to healthy eating, active living, and tobacco control in order to address chronic diseases. And those are things like obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. And I'm in the research and evaluation unit in our bureau. And most of my work, as Glad said, is focused on evaluating our healthy eating related programs. So for the rest of my presentation, I'm going to give a broad overview of how we approach evaluation in public health. And I thought first it would be helpful to just talk about why we even do evaluation in the first place. And this was touched on it in the introduction, but I think the most common reason is that we want to know if an intervention is working. And by intervention, I mean a policy, program, a media campaign, a building, or a product you're designing, whatever it is we're doing to intervene on the lives of people. Another really common reason that we do evaluation is to advocate for something. We want data that will help us get more funding for our program or encourage replication. And then another really common reason is that we don't have a choice. So especially if you're doing grant-funded work, funders often require us to evaluate that work. So before you can really plan and carry out an evaluation, you first have to understand what it is you're evaluating. So what is the problem that's being addressed, what resources and strategies will be used to address it, and what's the desired impact. And a tool that we often use to help us do this in public health is called a logic model. And I'm just curious, how many people here have ever heard of a logic model? Okay, so like half of people. All right, so I'm not speaking a completely foreign language. So logic model is basically a visual depiction of your program theory, and it sort of maps out what you hope to achieve and how you plan to do it. And there are a lot of other similar tools out there. A theory of change and a causal pathway are other related tools you might have heard of. So this is an example of a logic model. This is drastically simplified from what we would normally have, but it's easier to present this way. This is for a New York City Health Department program called Come See What's Cooking Kids, which does nutrition education for children in farmers markets that serve low-income communities. So starting at the left, the first column is for inputs, and these are the resources that go into a program. And in this case, the inputs are nutrition curriculum, coupons for local produce, and staff. The next column is the activities that are carried out by the program. In this case, these are leading nutrition classes at farmers markets and distributing coupons to participants so that they can buy produce. The outputs come next, and these are the direct products of those activities. So for this program, the outputs are that participants receive nutrition information and they receive coupons for produce. And then next, with this big box at the right, we have our outcomes. And these are basically the changes that are produced by the program, or that we hope will be produced by the program. And we typically divide these into short-term, intermediate, and long-term outcomes. Short-term outcomes for this program are increased knowledge and improved attitudes around eating produce and nutrition, increased purchasing power so that people can buy more produce, and then intermediate outcomes are increased fruit and vegetable consumption, and the long-term outcome is decreased risk of heart disease. So one thing that's really key in this process, and I actually think it's a common challenge for people, is to make sure that it's reasonable to expect your strategies to lead to your identified outcomes. So for example, just increasing fruit and vegetable consumption alone doesn't actually lead to weight loss. So if we were planning a program that was focused on fruit and vegetable consumption, we wouldn't want to have reduced obesity rates as our long-term outcome, because we would probably never actually show that outcome with our intervention. And if you think about the logic model that I just had up there, that weight loss or obesity rates wasn't up there. But how do you know? How do you know what's reasonable to expect? So for us in public health, a really important resource is peer-reviewed literature. And this basically means articles that are published in academic journals that have been through a rigorous review process. Another important resource is experiential or practice-based knowledge, theory, and expert input. So getting into evaluation planning, I first just want to acknowledge that there are many different types of evaluation. For example, process evaluation is really common, and this is where you're making sure that a program has been implemented the way it was intended to be. But for today, when we're talking about impact, we're really talking about outcome evaluation. And this is where we're trying to measure the change produced by a program or some other intervention. And there are a lot of other terms that get at the same idea, including impact assessment, impact evaluation, effectiveness evaluation, and there are even more, but they're all basically getting at the same idea. So when you're planning an evaluation, one thing you generally do early on is establish your overarching evaluation questions. These should be informed by the goals of the intervention, and they're the key questions that you're going to be trying to answer through your evaluation. You also need to think about what's realistic when you're figuring these questions out. So how far out can you measure your outcomes or impact? Can you focus on a long-term outcome like decreased risk of heart disease, or do you really need to focus on the short-term and intermediate outcomes? And in public health, that's often where we focus, because it would take years for us to measure the long-term impact. Another important thing to consider is what are your resources? How much money do you have? Because that's also going to affect the kind of question that you can answer. So getting into evaluation design, the gold standard here is a randomized control trial. And this is an experiment where subjects are randomly assigned to a treatment group and to a control group, and that control group doesn't get the treatment. So they get maybe a placebo or they get nothing. And this is something we generally associate with clinical drug trials, but it can also be used for research, other kinds of research, and for evaluations. But randomized control trials are really expensive. They are often not possible or even ethical to do. So there's the randomized control trial, but then there's reality, and that's where most public health evaluation falls. And this is quasi-experimental or observational design, sort of loosely called one of those two things. And the main distinction here is that these kinds of designs don't involve this random assignment to a treatment and a control group. And one thing I want to point out is this kind of issue of causation versus association. So it's only with a randomized control trial that we can attribute causation to an intervention. With a quasi-experimental or observational design, because we're not randomly assigning people to those groups, we can't be sure that any changes we see are due to what we did, or they could be due to something else that's going on. So we can never say our intervention caused the changes we see with a quasi-experimental or observational design, but we can say there's an association there, and we can say there's a strong association there. And when we plan these kinds of evaluations, we're really trying to think about how can we show a strong association and make the case that it was our intervention that produced that change and not something else that was going on. So we want to kind of try to plan our evaluation in a way that allows us to rule out alternative explanations for any changes that we see. So one really common strategy here is to use a pre-post design. So this is where we measure outcomes before and after an intervention. It's also really helpful to have a control group. So this will hopefully allow you to be able to say, look, we saw these changes in our intervention group, but not our control group. So that helps us make the case that it was our intervention that produced those changes. But these kinds of designs aren't always feasible, they're not always appropriate, and there are a lot of other options as well. One thing that's really important, or not important, but helpful when you're planning an evaluation is to use multiple strategies so that when you're looking at all of your data, you have different sources of data that you can look at to try to understand what's going on. So another part of evaluation design is data collection, and this is obviously really key. You need to think about who's going to comprise your sample, how are you going to collect the data, are you going to do surveys, observations, use secondary data like the census, use qualitative methods like focus groups. And once you collect your data, you have your analysis and interpretation, and I think interpretation where you're kind of looking at your findings and trying to make sense of them. For that piece, it's really important to involve stakeholders. So other people who helped with implementing or carried out the intervention, they should be involved here to help you make sense of what's going on. And then there's dissemination, where you're sharing your findings with others. So I'm going to switch gears for my last few minutes here, since I'm a public health person talking to an audience of designers. I wanted to just talk about some opportunities for collaboration between the public health world and the design world. So one area is active design, and I think there's already a lot of collaboration going on here. And I'll just give a little plug. We have the Fit City Conference coming up May 11th, which is all about active design. But I think another area where there's a lot of opportunity is in improving the food environment. So the health department and a lot of other agencies do work with bodegas and supermarkets to get them to carry and promote healthy foods. And this photograph here is of a supermarket in the South Bronx, and it has a healthy checkout line. So basically the items stocked at the checkout line are healthy foods rather than the candy that you would typically see. So this is one thing we're working on, but I think a design perspective would really contribute a lot to something like this. And then I thought I would give one specific example of a collaboration with the School of Visual Arts Impact Design for Social Change program, which we were just hearing about. So back in 2010, we partnered with a team of designers to kind of help us think about our food retail work. And they went into some of the bodegas we were working in, and they took photos of all these in-store marketing materials we had. And they came back and pointed out that the materials lacked a consistent visual voice and that they basically wouldn't have known they were all from the same program if we hadn't told them ahead of time. So this is probably really obvious to all of you as designers, but it honestly had never even crossed our minds. And it was like a really big aha moment for us. So after this, we put a lot of resources into redesigning our materials and just tried to get them looking more professional, using the same font and the same colors, some really basic concepts, and just have a more cohesive and powerful presence in the store. And a few years later, we actually had the chance to look at the impact of these materials. As part of a broader evaluation of our food retail work, we did surveys with community residents in some of the neighborhoods that we were working in. And among 500 residents that we surveyed, 65% reported seeing the materials at a store in their neighborhood, about half of whom purchased a product due to seeing those materials. We also asked those respondents if they had seen decoy materials. So these are materials which actually were not up in the neighborhood, but we asked them if they'd seen them, and recognition of those materials was just 11%. So this is an indication that large numbers of people did in fact see our materials, because this recognition of the decoy materials was so low and the recognition of our materials was so high. So it lets us say it's probably not just that people felt sorry for us or were trying to be nice or felt pressured to say they'd seen our materials, that there's probably it's probably a good indication that a lot of people saw them. So I'm going to end there. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next presentations.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Our next panelist is Chelsea Malden, who just disappeared for a second. She is a social scientist and strategic designer with a focus on public sector innovation. She directs the Public Policy Lab, which is a New York City-based nonprofit that's dedicated to improving the design and delivery of public services. The Public Policy Lab partners with government agencies to help develop more satisfying and effective services through user-centered research and design prototyping, testing, and evaluation. Previously, she has led a community development organization, has overseen government partnerships at public space advocacy nonprofits, and consulted with multiple municipal and federal agencies. Please join me in welcoming Chelsea.
Hello, thank you so much. So, as Gilad helpfully said, the Public Policy Lab is a nonprofit, and what we do is we design services with the public. We were founded in 2011. All of our projects are partnerships with government agencies, and always the goal is to improve public services, and specifically improve public services which are delivered to poor and vulnerable populations, low-income people, children, seniors. What that actually means in terms of how I spend my day is that we provide assistance to federal agencies who are looking to integrate design into large-scale federal programs. We provide assistance to municipal agencies in various places across the country who are also similarly looking to use human-centered and other design and research methods. We work some with various kinds of innovation advocates, like philanthropies, but most importantly, and what I think of as the kind of core of our work, is doing service design with New York City agencies. So what do our design projects look like? They look something like this. This is probably the kind of diagram that many of you have seen or made in your own work if you do strategic design work. So we think of our work as proceeding across 3 stages. First, an ethnographic discovery stage, where we really try to understand what's happening in a given service. How is the service experienced by the people who are using the service, the end users, but also how are the frontline service providers experiencing that service? Because if they're not experiencing it well, then presumably the service is never going to function well. How are middle managers, how are policymakers experiencing that service in terms of their contribution to overseeing it and regulating it? Subsequent to discovery, so at the end of discovery, typically we have a set of recommendations for our partners. whom we have usually dragged with us to do all of our ethnography. We, at this point, refuse to do any projects with public agencies without them seconding staff to our design team, because we feel that they really have to participate in the learning and the making of the work, because eventually, when we get to stage 3, we're going to hand off the work to them for implementation. So they have to really believe it and know what it is. So at the end of discovery, moving back, we typically have a set of recommendations that we think of as prompts for design. They are not solutions, they're rather pathways that we think our agency partner could follow. And moving into design, which we again do collaboratively with all the stakeholders, with frontline service providers, with members of the public, we try to begin making things and prototyping them through a method which is often called co-design or collaborative design. I think I want to acknowledge here that it is not as as we might all like to pretend it is. That I have yet, and this is certainly a failing of mine, and I invite you all to give me better methods, but so far what we find is that it's very challenging to ask non-designers to simply show up and make. Like making and making out of nothing is actually a learned professional skill. So we find typically that what we do is we pre-make. We try to make things that are ugly and rough, and we bring those to our groups of stakeholders and then ask them to remake with us. And that's the nature that the collaborative work takes. The iterative process, though, is incredibly important in terms of being able to return multiple times. I'd love to do a project where we could do that for a lot of time, but typically there's only this much money. So your number of cycles is, of course, dependent on budget and time. At the end of design, we end up with prototypes. Those prototypes may be of specific tools or materials. Those prototypes are almost always, however, prototypes of interactions. Because a lot of times what we're talking about when we talk about public service and public service delivery is about a member of the public engaging with some frontline service provider. And often what we find is that it's not that they want or need a new app or a new brochure. They need to have a new kind of interaction in which different sorts of information and different kinds of postures toward each other occur. So often the more tangible outputs that we create are really tools to try to drive a new kind of interaction. What we also typically do at that point is propose a theory of change. So thank you very much for explaining so well what a logic model is and what a theory of change is. And we say, all right, we've gone to the point where we think this should be implemented, and we think this is what it will do. And we propose to our partner that they do test implementations of the prototypes that we've made, and that we evaluate the efficacy of those test implementations. So I'm going to give you a quick run-through of a project that we recently completed with the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development. 5 minutes, very quick run-through. So this was a partnership between the Public Policy Lab, the DESIS Lab, which is a research lab at Parsons, and HPD, and was generously supported by the Rockefeller Foundation. Thank you. How did that work? We did collaborative design with people who are both residents in affordable housing in the South Bronx and in Central Brooklyn, and also with people who had applied successfully or unsuccessfully but were not currently living in affordable housing projects. We also did quite a bit of work with frontline providers, both at community-based organizations and at for-profit and not-for-profit housing developers, and we worked quite closely with members of the agency themselves. We ended up, this is like I'm giving you the wildly compressed version of what was actually a relatively long and complicated project, so there's more to be known about how that work occurred if you're interested. We ended up designing 5 new informational materials for the agency, only one of which, this advertisement, is, you would hardly believe it, but actually quite an improvement on the older version of this ad. The other materials are new. They didn't previously exist, and they kind of filled informational holes in people's service journey. What we said, though, to the agency, and what they also agreed, was that it wasn't enough simply for us to make these materials. Rather, we actually had to also invent new ways for there to be information exchanged between various people who were participating in the dissemination of knowledge about affordable housing. That the agency itself needed a mechanism by which they could interact with people in a much more face-to-face way, because they didn't have much face-to-face interaction with the public. That additionally, community-based organizations were a kind of underutilized resource, that they were doing a lot of work to get information about affordable housing out to the public, but there was not a really strong connection between the agency and those organizations. And that finally, the affordable housing developers themselves could do a better job of reaching people in kind of places of everyday life with information about affordable housing opportunities. So we developed 3 programs that were about creating these new information exchange opportunities, sort of within the context that each of those stakeholder groups were already acting. This is Emily. She works at HPD. She's horrified that I go around town showing her Gantt chart. But her Gantt chart, in many ways, was an incredibly moving moment for us in this project, because this was the agency's internal implementation plan for how they were going to push these 4 proposals out into the world. When I saw this, I knew that they actually owned it, that we had designed these things together and that they had taken ownership of them and translated them into their agency's kind of internal DNA. And I thought, aha, we've made it, actually. These aren't going to just go off and die in a corner somewhere. So what was it we were trying to do? Here is the theory of change for this process, which I will let you read at leisure some other time. But essentially, it follows the same model that Rachel helpfully outlined. So I want to talk a little bit about the nature of the evaluation that we did. So let me actually go back for just a moment. So activities, those are the 4 proposals. Objectives, kind of top-line things that we thought we were doing with those proposals, and then short-term outcomes, long-term outcomes, and a kind of ultimate intended impact that we hoped that the implementation would get to. So when it came time to do the actual evaluation, we actually were like, oh, how are we going to do this? Well, let's just look back at our theory of change and ask ourselves, what questions would we have to ask? What activities would we have to carry out in order to be able to figure out if we did any of this? Like, when making the theory of change, it felt honestly a little plastic. Like, is this a real thing? Are we just making this thing that one is supposed to make? But it was incredibly helpful in terms of providing a kind of organizing structure to how to do the evaluation when we got to the point of doing the evaluation. So I'm going to take you really quickly through some of the questions we asked. And the questions were, again, to Rachel's very nice introduction, like about both process and impact. So we were trying to figure out, were the pilots successfully implemented? And then to whatever degree they were implemented, did they have the impact we were hoping for? So we asked a whole series of things about how the pilots encouraged information accessibility and exchange, and we kind of graded ourselves as to whether we were effective or not. Similarly, did they account for applicants' lived realities? This was a big problem in some of the materials that we saw that were being pushed out into the world. Did they enable informed decision-making? Then, did they actually meet our intended short-term outcomes and our intended long-term outcomes to whatever degree we could assess? And I thought I had one more on there, which was, did we meet our ultimate intended goal, which the answer was, we don't know, because we're not there. Oh, I'm out of time. I'm so close to being done. So how did we assess this? We did a bunch of both qualitative and quantitative assessments. You apply for affordable housing through an online portal. During the period of our pilot assessment, 250,000 New Yorkers applied for affordable housing through this online system. Each one of them was shown a sort of intercept survey opportunity of really giving 1% of them agreed to take our intercept survey and gave us feedback on, this was the number of downloads of the materials that also happened through that same portal. They gave us feedback on what they thought of the materials that we had created. So that gave us some good kind of raw numbers on both how many people saw these things and what they thought about them. Additionally, we did more like kind of on the street surveying of people. When we would do pilots in communities, we would kind of grab people and give them little postcard surveys and ask them to fill them out, and would also do a little bit of on the spot interviewing of people. And we also did shadowing. So when various community members and other partners were actually implementing these pilots, we would literally just follow them around all day and see what happened. And let me tell you, New Yorkers are not shy about giving their own opinions. So sometimes our shadower would be shadowing some professional, and then like 3 or 4 other people would come along and give their opinions. So God bless us all for having that attitude. So in the end, what did we think we did? We think we did about this well. Some of the stuff that we had attempted to do, we felt like, yeah, we actually managed to do those things. Other things were like, not sure that we were actually as effective as we would like to be. And then ultimately, this ultimate question of whether or not we really made it so more eligible people applied, unclear. And really getting back to some of the things that Rachel raised, I'm not sure that we could have assessed that well without having the ability to do a more of a randomized control trial. If you're interested in this work, there are 2 books, both of which are available as free downloadable PDFs on the Public Policy Lab website. The first of which describes the discovery and design process in great detail. And the second of which is a report specifically just on the evaluation. So some of the graphics that you saw here are pulled from that publication, and there's more information about exactly what we did to do the evaluation. Also, that digital version includes all of our evaluation materials. So all of our raw surveys, all of that stuff is included as an appendix, and we encourage people to steal it and reuse it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Chelsea.
Sure.
Our final panelist is Sasha Dichter. He is the Chief Innovation Officer at Acumen. Sasha oversees Acumen's work in metrics and impact, and is a noted speaker and author on generosity, philanthropy, and social change. His writing has been featured by Harvard Business Review, Stanford Social Innovation Review, among many other publications. And his full list of accomplishments and accolades is far too long for us to list right here. But needless to say, he's a true thought leader in this field and has a wealth of knowledge and expertise to share with us. So please join me in welcoming Sasha.
Yeah. Okay, hi. So we come from very different worlds, and there's so much consistency in everything that I'm hearing from Rachel and Chelsea. So I'm going to try to do 2 things. One is explain a little bit the world that I live in, which is this funny impact investing world, which is both social change and business and how they come together, and try to talk a little bit about how impact assessment works in that world. And hopefully that can serve as a little bit of a bridge to our afterwards conversation. Okay, so Acumen, we're down the street on 15th Street. We were founded in 2001. We invest in companies, leaders, and ideas to change the way the world tackles poverty. I'm going to focus mostly on the companies piece of this, and then obviously the ideas is how we measure and how we know we're making change. But in the leadership piece, a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about is actually available on our Plus Acumen website in courses that we have done in partnership with IDEO on human-centered design, as well as courses that we've done on our own on impact measurement and impact assessment. Since 2001, we've invested about $88 million in 82 companies. We've reached about 125 million people and created about 60,000 jobs. So at a very headline level, we feel like we're having a pretty broad reach and reaching a lot of folks with new solutions that really matter to their lives. To just give you one example of what this looks like in real life. So 2 guys named Sam and Ned come out of the Stanford Design School in about 2006, 2007. Sam had been a Peace Corps volunteer and had seen a kerosene lamp burn the daughter of the family that he had been living next to. And he thought that that was just crazy and thought there must be a way to eradicate kerosene, which is a primary source of light for about 1.5 billion people in the world. It's dirty, it's expensive, it's dangerous. And so they decided to build a company, and Acumen invested in 2007 in that company. We made an equity investment in a startup company. We don't normally do startups. We did in this case. And their idea was, could they bring a solar-powered light, it looks like that little thing over there in the corner, to replace kerosene all over the world. Then in 2008, we made another investment in the company, and by then they had reached about 200,000 people. They were experimenting with their model, and we were kind of accompanying them along the way. We continued to invest in the company to 2010, sequential rounds of investment, and at that point they had reached about 1.3 million people. If we had a lot more time, I would show you all the cool slides of how the product continued to evolve, and it has evolved a lot. But one of the headlines is they went from this product here, which is a $35 product, to about an $8 product in about 18 months' time. And on we go till things start to really have traction. And so, our hope is that we're seeding new ideas and new innovations, and over a course of time they can have really scaled impact. And obviously the power of a model that we're using is when there's a business approach and when there's a revenue stream associated with it, it can really scale to this level. So their aspiration as a company is they'll reach 100 million people by 2020. That would be nearly 10% of the market of folks that they're trying to reach in 13 years' time. So the scale of the impact has the potential to be very significant. And just a little context of the world that we're in. So we started in this work in 2001, this idea of being an impact investor. That name didn't even exist until about 2007. But now it's become an established thing. Got a lot brighter in here all of a sudden. So there are about 300 impact funds. They've got about $35 billion invested. And it's this kind of growing marketplace. But I would say it's a marketplace that's trying to figure out what it is. And there's sort of two trends that I would say are going on in our space. And so the first one is in our world, and again, it's its own little corner of the world, it feels like there's a conversation going on about whether everything is an impact investment. So if you're investing in India, are you an impact investor? Or if you're investing in the developing world? And in our corner of the world, we're focused in particular on poverty. And I don't think that there's a right or wrong answer to this question, but there is a real kind of lack of definitional clarity of what's in and what's out. And the second is a ton of talk about impact. So these sorts of conversations that we're having here are happening in our space a lot. And obviously the aspiration is to create impact, but I would say overall the measurement of whether or not we're creating that impact is nascent at best. And Ansley, you had said, we designers are late to the game. I don't think you're late to the game at all, actually. So for example, this just came out recently from the G7 Working Group on Impact Assessment, and this is the kind of thing we tend to produce in our space. And it is a completely great framework, one of a number of great frameworks we've produced, but I think its limitation is it doesn't tell you what to do once you're convinced that this makes sense. And so I think that's a problem. And so what we're trying to do is say, well, okay, if you're convinced that you have to assess and plan and do, how in the heck would you do that? And I think we have some answers to that. But before we do that, late to the game, this is a piece that came out less than a month ago by a guy named Jed Emerson, who's one of the original thinkers in the impact investing space on impact measurement. And so he wrote this on a blog that he writes. So the metrics challenge is something of a myth. It's the Bigfoot of impact investing, widely known yet seldom seen. At its core, the metrics discussion is a myth because while everyone talks about it, professes to have seen it, and debates its importance, impact metrics remain ephemeral, a force living in some deep woods, visions of which are obscured by branches, brush, and bullshit. So that is a pretty good assessment of where we are. So lest you think that you are late to the game. But I think we have some good answers. And it's really about the practice of impact. How do you actually do this so that you can go from, so these are our headline numbers, 125 million reached globally, for example, 4 million people with crop alerts to farmers in Ghana, 34 million emergency care patients, and across India, and 8 million solar lanterns sold to customers in 62 countries. So those are our headlines. But of course, what you really want to know, to the point of these theories of change, which we use as well, is do farmers get better prices with better information, right? Click. Is ambulance service reaching the poorest customers? Are solar users switching away from kerosene? That's really getting underneath it from, it's possible that I'm changing someone's life to I'm actually changing someone's life. And I guess what I would say is that the headline for me, and what I'm increasingly coming to realize, is that impact is not a yes or no question, right? Well, in some cases, impact is a yes or no question. So if you can get a pair of eyeglasses on someone who never had them before, your before and after is pretty profound. And I love this picture. But in most cases, what we're trying to say is there's a scale of impact for us because we really care about poverty. We want to know who's being served. So there's who we're reaching. That's our second set of metrics. And the third set of metrics, which is the hardest, is how deep is that impact you're having? Are you transforming someone's life? Are you doing something that's meaningful enough that it makes a change? And in our world, how do you get answers to these questions in environments that look like this? So this is actually the data that one of our companies has in northern Uganda. So you can talk about data and measurement and all this sort of thing, but you go to an entrepreneur and say, hey, I want to talk to you about your theory of change and the data we're getting back. And it's like, do you know the world that I live in, right? Systems are not robust, all these good things. And so we have started something in the last 12 months called our Lean Data Initiative, which I hope answers the how question. And so I'll give you an example of this. One of our companies is called Isoko. They are transmitting data on prices to farmers in Ghana. The idea being, if you have price information, you'll know what crops to plant or where to sell them, and that will increase your incomes. And so what we said is, hey, wait, isn't this really interesting? All of these farmers in the world, pretty much, even all of our customers, have mobile phones, right? And so could we use those mobile phones to ask them a set of questions that normally you would have a bunch of surveyors come around to answer? And so we surveyed them using simple text messages and SMSs. And what we learned very quickly was two things. One is, thanks to a series of questions developed by the Grameen Foundation, we learned who we were serving for the first time. So the company actually found out that 75% of all of their customers are below the poverty line in Ghana, versus 40% of all the customers in Ghana, all poor rural customers in Ghana. So A, we know that they're serving the poor, and we actually got this answer very quickly and very easily. Secondly, the company is sharing the information of what the prices are. But the company, even though it's a completely data-centric company that has call centers, all this stuff, had no idea what prices people were actually getting. So we could actually get data back from customers and say, okay, you got this price alert, what's actually happening? And from a simple SMS, you can get that data back, and you can square the circle between what you thought would happen and what's actually happening. Such that we now have a CEO of a company saying, our goal, to the point of a theory of change, is he says to the company internally, our goal is to have every single one of our farmers get $150 a year of income increases as a result of our price alerts. That's what we're in the business of doing. And again, it's a claim that a CEO could only aspire to if you have kind of a full loop of data. And again, we can talk in the panel a little more about how, but fundamentally it's about using existing infrastructure and existing technology to have a feedback loop from customers about what it is that they're actually realizing in terms of change. And so going back to Jed's initial question of, is this sort of this Bigfoot thing out there, I think the shift that we can make, and what I hear coming through all of these things, but even in our very dynamic, very resource-constrained environments, if there is a shift, which I would hope is very aligned with kind of a design approach to thinking about things, there is not kind of creating a company, a service, or whatever over here, and then there's sort of impact over here. And when I get even nervous about randomized control trials being the quote-unquote gold standard is the way that traditional methodology works says, do something, and then figure out your theory of change, your logical framework, whatever it is, and then spend lots of money and lots of time to figure out if you succeeded. And everything else in the world, if you're building a business, or you're building a program, or if you're figuring out if a new product works, has very, very short cycle times of learning and feedback loops all along the way. So where I worry about that being a gold standard in everything other but the really large scale projects that you want to say, okay, I've done this at this scale, I want to do it 10 times the scale, is can we have something that brings that voice of the customer and whether or not we're changing their lives as a constant feedback loop into the process. And so, what we've been arguing, so for example, for D-Light, we talked about 40 million people having access to these solar lights. The more we can understand, does it actually eradicate kerosene? And if the answer to that is no, it's not, oh, the company is a failure. The answer to that is, well, what in the heck is going on? Wouldn't that be a valuable insight for the company to say, oh, well, I'm learning that what I thought it could happen and what's actually happening, there's a big gap. What's going on? How do I change my product? Because if I can change my product in such a way that I can close that gap, don't you think that money they're spending on kerosene will be available for other things, whether it's to buy my product or to recommend it to another person? So this disparity between I'm building a great company and there's impact over here, I feel like where we change the conversation is to say creating impact is about creating value for customers. Creating value for customers is really about creating value for the company. And if we can create this alignment between customer satisfaction and delighting customers and the impact we're creating for them, then I think all of a sudden it goes from being out in the corner to in the center. So that would be my hope. Thank you.
So now we get to actually talk with them. So thank you guys all for speaking. I think we're really excited to hear each of you kind of interact with each other and ask each other some questions about impact measurement. We have a few questions just to sort of get the ball rolling. So the first question is, each of you spoke about the role impact assessment plays in your work and how it's part of your process. And a lot of the people here, are very interested in incorporating impact assessment into their work and their process in some way. And I'm wondering how it kind of came to that for all of you, and whether there was a specific project you worked on or a specific experience you had that led you to really see the value of impact assessment and how it could play a key role in your work.
Okay, I'll go first. Well, all I do is that, so it plays a big role in my work for the most part. But I mean, actually, while you were talking, Sasha, I was thinking about, this issue of sometimes what you're doing being here and the impact piece being there, and how it's so much stronger if they're linked and intertwined. And for some of the work I've done at the health department, I've been lucky to be really incorporated into teams that are actually doing the work. And then there's like a better feedback loop between the data I'm getting and the work that they're doing. I was just thinking about how, if things aren't working, you need to know why. And some of the food retail work at the health department has really evolved since 2006. We have like a completely different approach to working with bodegas, and now we're working with supermarkets than we did originally. And it was because of continuous impact assessment sort of telling us, okay, we just did a ton of work and not really that much changed. So we don't want to waste our resources doing this. Let's figure out how we can do it better. And we've literally had I think we're on our 4th iteration now of how to work in communities with stores to improve access to healthy foods. And I think we finally feel like we found a model that we're happy with. But those are some of my thoughts.
I guess for me, it's and I do worry actually a lot about both the language and then the process feeling kind of intimidating, so that it's this domain of experts. But I feel like people make decisions all the time based on kind of what they're able to learn. And to me, it's been since day one. If we're an impact investor and we're trying to build this field and we don't know what impact is, then I don't know what field we're building. And so it's more been about what's the best way to incorporate the voice of the customer in, and doing that in a continuous way. And I feel like when we start the conversation that way, we just have a different experience with an entrepreneur. Then would it be okay if we kind of bothered a few people to figure out if you're actually doing what you said you would? It's not an audit and accounting function. It's a value creation. And when they figure out, am I not creating the value I thought I would, then they're excited to make changes. And so there is that shift. And what Rachel, your presentation was so clearly laid out. So we do all the things that you described. But I think there is some expertise in doing that really, really well. But at the same time, to your point, the more that this can become integrated, I think the more value you create for everybody, and also showing that, hey, I can use these tools to figure out how I'm doing better today, as opposed to something that I send off to some funder to justify that their money was well spent. It's just, that's not the dynamic we need, and I think it really underplays the power of the insight we can create. So.
I think there's a way in which designers who work, or human-centered designers who design with someone outside of their design team, are doing a form of impact assessment in the design process. Right. Like when you design with non-designers and you do that iteratively, what you are asking is, to what degree does this really bad prototype work? You are continually assessing the impact through the design process. So there's a way in which you're already thinking that way. So I would say that first. Then I would say, I find in my work that government agencies are willing to buy design product that they are not willing to use. People are interested in doing better stuff and having more impact, but when it comes right down to it, it is so complex operationally often for a public agency to do to actually push the designs that it has procured out into the world, that the work does not actually end up going and living. So I think that one of the things that really motivated us was not from the beginning so much saying, oh, how do we assess the impact of our work? It was, how do we even make our work go? How do we make it so that the work that we made actually gets used? And so we have 5 different strategies to try to make that happen. One of them is then that the government agency says, oh, but so one of those is to say, you don't have to really use this. You just pilot it. Just see if it does anything. And we can't quite say, do that because we think that once you do that, then you'll actually like it and you'll want to scale it. But one of the more kind of appropriate motivations we can give for saying do this pilot is then you can see what the impact is from having done this pilot. So there's kind of like it's almost like a backing into the impact argument, if that makes sense. I mean, I think the other thing that I talked to Gilad and Ansley about a little bit when we were talking about doing this was this question about the difficulty of getting government agencies to be willing to assess the impact of programs, even programs that they are willing to implement. Because doing an assessment is actually risky. You might discover that the thing that you just spend a bunch of money and time on only maybe does this much of a difference. Or maybe.
And to that point, I mean, I think what's challenging then is, and where we're really excited about these I mean, literally, you know, for us to get this data back with 1 or 2 or 3 companies might cost $5,000. I mean, really small amounts of money. I think by necessity, if 3 years have gone by for a multi-million-dollar project and you spent whatever on the evaluation, the stakes have to be high. Like the only thing that can be a success is, wow, we did something really important. Whereas if you're going to do this 6 times a year for the next 3 years, and the first 4 it comes back and goes, gosh, we haven't done it, well, that's fine, because you're at the beginning and you're supposed to be changing and you're supposed to be learning. But if it's at the moment at the end and it's a report card, well, how is everybody going to feel anything other than, well, this is a grade on whether or not we spent our time well? And I just think that that dynamic, if the more we can break that dynamic, it's totally natural that, and we have that, even in that context, we have data that we show to people that's different than what they expect. And some of them say, great, let's move, and some of them say, I'm going to just thank you very much and put that over in the corner.
And I think that's what the prototyping process for designers tries to get to. You try to actually make a lot of iterations of things in a way which is really fast and cheap, and do really fast and cheap trials of it, so that you, by the time you are actually doing a kind of proper pilot test, you've actually done a whole bunch of testing and assessing already. One of my board members, who is wise in many things, said, you know, the thing about a pilot for a government agency is that a pilot can't fail in a government context, and you can argue with that if you'd like. But you know, his viewpoint was that you know, like really, it's extremely problematic in a public sector environment as opposed to in a commercial environment. Like even more problematic for something which is paid for with the public dollar and is intended to generate public good, for it to actually not work.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking sometimes there is that conversation with people where like, okay, you want to evaluate this. What are you going to do if we don't find good results? And are you comfortable with that? And what does that mean for your program? So it's definitely something to think about. And to your point too, I think it's a good reason to have that process integrated so you have like a continuous feedback loop. So it's not like at the end, 3 years later, oh, we just wasted a lot of time.
Yeah, I wonder what that means for designers then. You know, I mean, Chelsea, you've been formally trained in design. And work with designers very often. And so this idea of designer coming in and telling you, I'm going to do this new thing that you maybe don't think is so valuable, but also I'm going to test it for you, and it might not work either. And as you mentioned, designers are much more comfortable with this idea of prototyping and iteration, but these larger organizations oftentimes aren't. Even small companies aren't really comfortable with that. So I'm wondering what your view on that is, how a designer could really start that conversation with an organization and convince them that this is a valuable process to engage in.
I think that there is a lot of pressure now kind of in the public sector innovation universe to demonstrate impact. So partly, and that's coming, I think, mainly from funders. People know they're supposed to do something around that. That's helpful in a certain way, because we can say, well, we've actually got a way of doing that which will be fast and cheap because we are going to start doing it during the design process, to your point again, not at the end. We are going to be doing assessment all the way through. So that helps some. I think having staff from the agency embedded in the team from the very beginning is hugely helpful. I think one big challenge that we've had again and again is that when you go into a context which is design poor, And then you have professional designers make new services and tools and interactions and materials. Often the agency is very hungry for them and says, oh, great, now we've got some good stuff. Let's use that. And they don't want to actually test then. They want to go straight to scale. So that's like the flip side of the resistance to rollout. It's let's roll it all out right now. So for example, with the housing project, we were actually not able to figure out any way to do that in little bits. Like we had none of those materials, and then we had those materials being downloaded by 500,000 people. And there was no in between. We did a project for Medicare where we rolled out a new set of communications materials that started being sent to 37 million people that were never tested in any way beyond outside of our design process.
Awesome.
That's not what I think should happen.
No, it sounds scary. It sounds terrifying.
Sasha, what would you say to an organization or firm that was coming to Acumen as a potential funder and would say things like that? How would you respond to them?
As a funder? What do you mean? As an organization that we would invest in?
Yeah.
Besides, maybe there could be a step. I mean, I don't know. Is the short answer. No, I mean, I think that I guess what I would say is we also shouldn't be too precious about all of this. That is, there's kind of the right and the best answer, and there's an organization and how it really works, and we're going to have both. I mean, I think it's really fascinating actually to hear you say there's kind of both, right? There's I did this really great thing and it got killed because nobody really wanted it, and I did this, I don't know if it's a great thing or not, and it went to 37 million people, so go
Right, and I'm sure it's better than what they had, and I was actually just thinking, well, if that many people are downloading it, is that some indication of its success and kind of, it's user friendly. People were accessing it.
I mean, I think there's actually a kind of I sometimes ask, to what degree are we as designers actually suited to take up some of the challenges in front of us? Which is, it may just be that there is a profound need for affordable housing. And so people will look at anything that they think will help them. And the question is, did we actually do a good job helping them with that? Was our effort sufficient to meet their needs?
Well, so one thing I actually was wondering related to that during your presentation, because you said you weren't able to look at your long-term outcome, which was increased people applying for public housing?
Increased numbers of eligible people applying.
I mean, couldn't you compare, since this project happened, what those numbers are versus the year before your project happened, or compare, and then, you know what I mean?
I mean, we could, but I think, and that would be, I would love to do that. I think some skeptics would say, how are you going to prove that it was your materials that moved those numbers?
Right.
At all?
Yeah.
And again, and I think that word, and we've been talking a lot internally about prove versus improve, and I just feel like every time you hear the word prove, you know what kind of conversation you're having. And again, it's understandable that a funder is going to say prove yes, prove no, and fine, that's the world you're going to be in. But I do think fundamentally it is more often than not a limiting conversation. And also we have to be humble about what, so there's if I have an intervention over here, but what actually needs to happen to make the change in the whole affordable housing sector is my thing plus 8 other things, it is also a difficult situation to be in where we say, well, what our funders expect is us to be able to speak to that. And really we're just one of 7 players in a system. So we're not in that business. Right. We're in the business of being one of 7 things. And so I just think that dynamic is the antithesis of a kind of a learning dynamic, really. And so that's, then I don't really, frankly, know how to change that in a consistent way, but just to recognize that's what that looks like. But I do think the best environments don't feel like.
One thing you were saying there at the end really, I thought was right on, which is about kind of telling, I'm probably not going to use the same words you did, but telling a better story about value. like telling a richer, and I think you actually used the word, a deeper story about the value that interventions have in people's lives. And there's a great little phrase that I want everyone to start using, which is not about trying to collect big data, but trying to collect thick data. And that what particularly an ethnographic approach to engaging with people about their experiences provides, both in the discovery phase of the project, but also in the evaluation phase of a project, is people telling stories about meaning. And that data is actually so much more interesting, I think. I think that I certainly need to get better at being able to articulate the value of that kind of data, as opposed to me being able to say, I have this survey and people answered these 10 questions.
Yeah. And I think one really powerful way to do impact evaluation is to use what we call in public health mixed methods, where you're doing both like the survey piece where you have your numbers, but then you also have a qualitative piece where you're doing focus groups or some sort of interviews, so you can kind of use that and the numbers to help really tell the story, to illustrate the impact of your program with like actual people who were impacted by it, as well as just numbers.
I would even encourage you, to whatever degree you can, not even to do kind of that sort of structured qualitative engagement like a focus group, but actually spend time with people who are living their lives and see to what degree their life is intersecting with whatever intervention you have created. I find that every minute that I spend actually with people in their workplaces or with people in their homes is like, it is the best time that I spend as someone who tries to make things. You know, that is the most fruitful and interesting time, is the time with people in their lives, not the time even back in the studio.
You mentioned before this idea that you had 37 million downloads. I'm sure that would be the success, right? But whether that's an indicator in and of itself, it makes me wonder whether throughout the process, are there other sort of latent indicators that are already built into things that are happening? And we talked about the difference between impact assessment being at the end versus being throughout the process. Is that they're already there and we're just not looking for the right indicators? And is there some sort of approach in terms of thinking that we could take on that would help us start to try and identify where those opportunities are already built into the projects we're doing?
I mean, so I think the answer to that is probably yes. And to kind of, Rachel, you did us a service by showing a theory of change. I mean, that's how we, because that is a precursor to everything that we do. And I guess what I would say about that is, as we've been rolling this out for ourselves internally, actually getting that part right, if there is a part that requires actually some real expertise, or at least practice, I would say it's that part. Because doing that well is not as easy as it might seem, because there's outside data and just, anyway, for a bunch of reasons. But I think to answer your question, so we like to talk about impact risk, right? So what is what is meant to happen, and what is the risk that it does and doesn't happen? And when we talk about what to measure, it's about the connections between each of those steps, right? So we were looking at a health insurance company in Kenya, and as you started out, it was saying, well, if people have health insurance, then they'll spend less money on healthcare. That sort of seemed like it would be the case. And what we discovered when we did a really good theory of change was actually all the data out there says that's not what happens. What happens is people consume more healthcare and maybe better healthcare, right? But each step along the way, you'd say, okay, so they have healthcare, and then I think they're going to do this, and as a result of doing this, they're going to do this, and as a result of that, this change will happen. And it's the linkages of those assumptions between those steps which tells us what data we need to collect. And so I think that they're in the process of doing that if you do it well, and that's really the rigorous exercise of figuring out what are those linkages. What am I assuming to be true about from the moment I have healthcare, how do I behave? I consume more, I consume less, or I go over here, I go over here. And that's where the richness comes. And so I think the data collection piece of it, which seems like the cool kind of technical piece, is cool and technical. But the thinking up front and getting the right people around the table and really going back to it of like, what do I believe to be true? And what are again, those linkages and those assumptions? I think that's been it feels a little bit inside the technique of doing this, but that's what I would look out for in the process of doing this, because that is, I think, where we find of everything, because you could collect everything, right? And you could go crazy with this thing, but usually we're in the business of collecting like 5 metrics or 10. And I think which one it is, it's around those assumptions about what happens when you go from I consume this, or I get the fruits and vegetables, and therefore, and as you just talk it through, it's just about being disciplined about your thinking, going through that process. And I think that's where we shine a lot of light on what we need to do.
Yeah, and I think that's such a great point, because I have seen so many surveys, developed by people as like a first draft when we're planning an evaluation. I'm like, I don't understand why you're asking about this, because your program doesn't have anything to do with it. But it's so easy to sort of conflate all of those things, because you're thinking, like health or like, so you just kind of have these assumptions that other things will kind of come from what you're doing, but the evidence isn't there to show that will happen. So I think that part takes a lot of, I think discipline's the right word, of just kind of thinking it through, looking at the literature. And sometimes you don't have to measure the long-term impact. I mean, if there's good evidence that doing some intermediate step will lead to that long-term outcome, why waste energy measuring the long-term outcome if that link has already been established?
I think there's actually also a really interesting design puzzle there, which is about what do we do instead of that little dashy line that goes from, here's the activity and here's what the outcome is going to be. Like, how do you actually visualize the actions that are going to occur in between the intervention and the outcome? And that's, something that we are conveniently glossing over with a little arrow. And that, I think that's probably that's going to be a little project for us on the next theory.
Yeah, no, but so you're with customers, and again, if you're sitting through and you think through that whole process, and then you can, not in a replicable way, but you could sit down and say, okay, so when I see this, when you see this flyer, what do you do with it, and do you apply, and does it teach you, whatever the case may be. But I think once you have that orientation towards, again, I love the simplicity of the fruits and vegetables X obesity, right? I mean, a lot of things have to happen between here and there, and if you can pull that apart and say, no, that alone isn't going to do that, but what might that alone do?
Can you talk a little bit about things that you've worked on which had either a relatively reliable seeming small scale impact, or a totally unreliable but very large scale impact? Like, we're working on a jail project right now, and one thing we could recommend is that the 4 hours before release from jail, different things, interactions, and services occur. And I feel like that's a thing that we could pretty firmly guarantee we can make some positive design interventions. A larger question might be, how could we stop people from becoming heroin addicts? And there are some design interventions that I could propose, but I feel like I have much less confidence that they would be effective or implementable. So, but they would potentially be much more transformative if they were effective. So I guess I wonder, in your work, how do you think about things that come to you at kind of either end of that scale?
Right. So if I understand the question, which is a great and hard one, is, in the language I'd use, it's sort of a depth versus breadth, right? So something that may be incremental but could reach 100 million people, or maybe transformative that could reach 10,000. I don't, frankly, think that we have a good way to choose between those things. I do think that the onus is upon us, if things are going to be small, to be a lot more confident that they're going to be transformative. Whereas if things are going to be, to a certain extent, like, have cell phones made people's lives better? I don't really think the world cares what my answer is to that question, because everybody demands them. No, really, it's there, and then it all of a sudden, when you get something that's that big, it becomes a platform, right? So that's kind of way over there at that end of the spectrum. So I don't know if that choice making, I guess I feel like, there's a very interesting, great organization called Give Directly that does, you can go to their website and give money to a poor person in Kenya. And there is formed by a lot of people with a very strong academic background that have observed that most development interventions are worse than handing people the cost of doing them, right? So that's our baseline, right? Our baseline is literally and metaphorically dropping money out of a plane. And it turns out that when you drop money out of a figurative plane, not only do you have short-term, but apparently you have long-term impacts on people's lives that are pretty significant because they know how to spend the money better, because there's no wastage, sort of you name it. So I don't think our bar is actually that high, right? We have to do better than that. So I don't want to be too fussy about like this was a good one and this was a great one, because most of the things we do don't seem to work nearly as well as we think. So if I've got two things that are good that I say I want to take a bet on this for a certain reason, that feels.
But do you find that you are more inclined to bet on the ones that are small but seem totally doable, or you are
No.
more inclined to bet on the ones that are only maybe doable but big?
Because the world that we're in, every problem is counted in the hundreds of millions or billions, we, for now, prefer things that seem to have the potential to be transformative. And again, a lot of that is the business model, and if it can work. But it's, the world has way too many interventions that are really great for 5,000 people. And look, great for 5,000 people can be amazing for 5 million people if by doing it once really well, you know how to do it 100 more times. But often each of those translations is really hard to do. And so we are looking for those things that can be really big. But that doesn't mean one knows how to find them. And that's the power of something that's really big and in the public health world and those sorts of things where we're in this very resource-constrained kind of startup, scrappy entrepreneur thing. And to be clear, whether it's impact assessment or design, I think it is a very different world. So if you're in the business of, you've deployed $10 million on something that you think probably works and you want to deploy 150 million or more, I'd want a pretty darn rigorous process to decide that I want to spend $150 million. But that's just, unfortunately, all the measurement stuff has been designed in that world. And then what's happened in our world is people are going, gosh, this doesn't really fit. And the reason they're saying that is because it doesn't really fit. And so where we're trying to break through a little bit, which I think, again, is so aligned with what a natural design orientation is okay, resource constrained, talking to customers, like, is there a way to do that? And it feels like there is a way to bridge these two things. And then hopefully go back in the other case. Because as you said, and I don't know if I was encouraged or not, that even in your formal public health world, the gold standard is like, gold standard in reality. So, we're all living in that world of what data will help us decide better rather than what's proof.
Yeah, and just to be clear, there's no expectation in the public health world that you need to do a randomized control trial to believe that something works and to put resources into it.
Right.
There are some really interesting precedents that are beginning to pile up about doing randomized controlled trials of different kinds of service delivery interventions coming out of these so-called nudge units that are being set up. The UK government has one, Singapore has one, where they're trying to make specific interventions in tools and services, and then people are randomly getting one or the other. And it's relatively fast and relatively cheap, and they're being able to measure outcomes. So it's out there as another model.
Yeah, I just want to ask one more question, and I want to open it up to the audience so we can get some questions from them. To bring it back to this idea of what role designers can play in all of this. Chelsea, you mentioned this idea of telling a better story and how that can be a really important part of the impact assessment, beyond just doing the actual data collection and analysis, but helping to communicate and disseminate what that means and what it means not only for the communities, but for the organization that's doing it and for their funders as well. And it seems like there's an opportunity there in terms of storytelling. That's something we talk about a lot in design. And I think it seems like a lot of designers are very hungry for this. Like, how can I get involved? I don't know research methods. I can't do that, or I don't realize that I can do that anyway. But storytelling, that's something I'm comfortable with. It's something I can do. I'm wondering, from all of you, where you think those opportunities are for designers with the design skill set and background to be able to really assist in the process in some way.
Storytelling, sure. I think that is a thing that designers sort of do both instinctively and through professional training. Although there is what we call the dreaded A word, anecdote. You have to be very careful to protect yourself from the perception that what you are sharing is an anecdote, because an anecdote is something which is dismissible. So there's a whole kind of question there around how you do that and how you construct storytelling that feels both personal and empathetic, but also feels more universal than the individual person's experience. something I had another thought in mind, but now it's gone from me. Here,
Okay, I can
talk
jump
and I'll
in.
jump
I mean,
in and I'll.
clearly we have a huge need in the public health world for help with that. I mean, I felt very self-conscious showing my boring PowerPoint slides to a room full of designers. So, and I think, you know, this is something I think about a lot, is how to show data to people in a way that's meaningful. And I think designers could help so much with this. And there's this whole field of data visualization, and it's so easy as a, you know, a data person to put like a really hard to decipher chart up or table with too many numbers and no one knows what you're talking about. And that's a big frustration I often have in the work I do. So I think a lot about how to communicate that stuff in a way that people understands, but I think the visual piece of it can help with that so much, and it's absolutely not a skill set I have at all. So if anyone is interested in that, please contact me.
I'm so bummed. I have the best data visualization slide. We did a cool project with Jer Thorpe at the Office of Creative Research, giving him a bunch of data from some of our, he used to be the head data artist for the New York Times, giving him a whole bunch of our data from 2 of our companies, and they just this incredible visualization of it. I do think that, you know, and you're in this world every day, so you know, I think I probably underestimate the challenges, but you know, bringing a human-centered approach to kind of how we interact primarily, you know, public services, you name it. I mean, it just seems like the leverage there is potentially enormous. And again, as a sector, we don't really, you know, telling something in a compelling way that shows, again, the richness, it's just not, as you say, it's not a skill that's really prevalent. So I think there's a lot there, and I just, again, think the attitude and the psychology of we as a profession, or the human-centered folks, know how to hear what end customers want. I think in the not-for-profit space and the development space, you name it, that's just not actually core. And one of the reasons I think it's not core is because when you're in sort of the aid-giving business, the feedback loop of somebody telling you if something's any good and if it helped them is just not built in the same way. And so I think we need to overcompensate for that, because you don't have a customer getting to cross their arms and saying, this product is crummy, so I don't want it. And so I think there is a ton of value. I mean, obviously, figuring out exactly where you fit in is going to be each person's piece of it. But I think we do need to do more, a lot more there.
We actually got a nice piece of feedback from one of our partners. The head of the jail system in this town where we're working mentioned to a colleague something which he was kind enough to pass along to our team, which was that he felt like our team, it was the first time he had worked with people who were trying to develop a solution that worked for jailed people and for the officers in the jail equally well. And that, I think, comes out of the user-centered orientation of the team, which is we really believe that both the officers and the jailed people are users of the jail, and that the solution has to serve everyone. And that, I think, and I think we almost take that for granted, but it's surprising to people who don't operate in this world, and it's something we can build on.
I have a lot more questions, but I know you guys probably do also. So I want to open up the floor if anybody else has a question they want to ask the panelists. Yeah.
Hi, thank you all so much. Really lovely to hear you talk. I run a design studio that works with nonprofits, and we do communication design work mostly. We work with bigger organizations like Kellogg Foundation and Head Start and American Foundation for the Blind, but we also work with really small nonprofits that don't have any data, and they come to us and they say, help us to be relevant and communicate what we're doing. And a lot of times they have 1 or 2 staffers full-time, and they have a board and a volunteer group. And we struggle with figuring out how to tell their story in a way that's not anecdotal, but has a little bit of quantitative and qualitative storytelling. Do you all have any advice for working with smaller organizations that are trying to tell the story and then measure?
Who are they trying to tell the story to?
So say, okay, we work with Head Start in Appalachia, West Virginia Head Start, and they serve families across the state and have amazing programs, but it took us about a year to figure out exactly what they did and help them tell their story on the top level. And now we are trying to figure out how to gather some data around what they do, and they service people within the Appalachian area, and then they are reporting to policymakers and funders in the Capitol in DC. So that's just one example, but it's generally a problem that we see across small nonprofits. Any advice, or if you had like one thing that you should recommend that they start with for impact measurement, what would you say?
Well, I would actually have them think about trying to partner with an academic institution. I mean, I think we do so much work with where students are doing a lot of the work. Sometimes professors have entire classes do like data collection and even analysis. So I think that if they're really under-resourced, it could be hard to really do something. But I think that finding someone to collaborate with who could help with that could be a way to really get some hard numbers. I mean, and then the other thing that came to mind is just, I think some of the process data that they already have about services provided, number of people reached, I mean, that alone can be very powerful. Especially Head Start, it's sort of, for that in particular, I feel like that has name recognition and people would assume that their model is probably working.
The only other, I think that's spot on. I mean, the only other thing that just strikes me is, and again, we've been thinking a lot about mobile phones and SMSs. Nancy Lublin from Do Something started this really great organization called Crisis Text a few years ago, and it's a text-based suicide prevention service for teens. And what I think is so powerful about that, besides just that it's amazing, is the kind of, again, the richness of conversation that people are having with teenagers using text messages, and also then the data that they're gathering from it. And it somehow has shifted my thinking about, oh, well, I could get a text message for a simple multiple choice question to actually, I could get kind of anything from that medium because people use it. And so I haven't seen examples of it yet, but except for where we're doing it so far in the developing world, but it just feels to me like almost everywhere everyone has a cell phone. Almost everywhere we have some way of interacting with them with it, and actually it may not even be kind of a poor cousin to the full conversation. In some places, I think Nancy's number was something like 97% of all texts are reads, even by teenagers. And so I actually think we have this secret communication vehicles with customers if we can just figure out what questions to ask them, and that we can engage them in a conversation over time. And so I don't know exactly what that means in terms of how it plays out, but I don't think you need a lot of skills or resources or professionals to do it. You can just start talking to folks potentially about impact, about other things. And I just wonder if that mindset shift might open up some doors where, again, if you're using students or other things, that this doesn't have to become this really heavy, rigorous thing. We can just start talking to folks, and they might answer us if we start asking them questions. So.
And I think your first question was very revealing. You said, who are you trying to convince? Like, who's the audience, right? And what do they care about? And what is the specific bit of data that might be a little bit difficult to collect, but if you can get that one piece, it's going to be really powerful for that specific audience. And it goes to Chelsea's point of, are you getting big data or getting thick data? It's catching on. It's working.
It's a hashtag, actually.
Just as a kind of flip side to Sasha's response, which I think is very smart, and I look forward to the project where we can actually get access to people's cell phone numbers. If you are, what we have often found is that because we're in a public sector context, there are a lot of limits to access to contact information for people who are using a service, and that oftentimes even within the service providers there are limits to how they are allowed to use personally identifying information for the users. But
is that
often,
just out of curiosity, and what if third parties do it? Same problem?
In terms of third-party service providers having access to that information? I don't know. Like, what we often have heard is that there's a problem with the agency doing the outreach. There's also a problem with the data itself, because often with a low-income population, the phone number is not stable because it ends up being a burner phone, which is only used for a short duration. So there's kind of two interlinked things there. But I'm going to be a champion here for a good old hard copy and say, particularly in a school setting, that there's a lot of paper that gets sent home with students, and you may be able to create a very simple paper piece that goes home with kids the way that the kids are carrying home everything else from school, and that is then you get a request to send it back. Like, that's not going to be 100%, but parents are very used to filling out things that their parents bring home on hard copy and sending it back to school the same way they got it. So I think that's to think about systems for information exchange that already exist,
Right.
and then you piggyback your assessment on top of a system that everybody is already used to.
That's a great one. And the one thing I kind of neglected to mention, so we've basically been using two kinds of techniques, and one is all this mobile phone stuff, which is sort of fun and whiz-bangy, but the other is exactly what you're saying, looking at an organization saying, where are they already talking to customers? So the first one of these projects that we did that was really great was with an ambulance company that had call centers. And they were calling people, not when they had an emergency, but afterwards, to ask them a whole bunch of questions. And we said, hey, can we pin on 10 questions to 2,000 of your calls? And we needed to train like 3 people who are already in the business of making phone calls. And can people who are delivering water, 200-300 days a year, 2 days can have someone go with them. So I think that, and I'd never thought of it in the school context, but where interactions and information flow is already happening is another excellent opportunity to add on to rather than build this whole kind of other separate process. I think it's a great point.
There's another question of you.
Just that in terms of the spirit of how does the design world and the kind of data or investor world, it's just very interesting to me that you refer to who we're getting information from as customers, and we in the design world refer to them as clients. And I'm wondering if there's a kind of paradigm, if there's something about that we can learn from actually talking about customers, and is there something that you can learn about talking about them as clients?
Yeah. Short answer would be yes.
Language always has.
Yeah.
Well, the thing is, in the world that, like the real nonprofit development world, you're supposed to talk about beneficiaries, right? Which I think is really more problematic still. So, but.
I'd also like someone to invent a word in English which means citizen, but comes freighted with none of the immigration legality implications. Because I would like to describe our work as being, for example, citizen-centered, but I don't in any way mean that to exclude people who are not actually legal citizens. And we don't actually have a good word that means that other than member of the public, which gets a little bit awkward to say over and over again. We've been trying just to say people.
And I realize we're running a little over on time, so we'll just take one more question, and we'll all stick around. So we encourage you all to stay and talk and discuss. Is there one last question someone has? Yeah.
Yeah. In terms of tracking all this, is there any is there any organization or anyone who's sort of like highlighting the success stories that are happening so that the perception?
There's a plant.
Not yet. But
And scientifically, like in terms of like really like where they actually almost in an open source way have to publish. The data that's provided so that it's sort of like the public can actually check in on these types of projects and see what's effective, what's not. So not yet. Is there?
I kind of know the answer to that question. It's the ones that run the organizations that run RCTs, like are particularly in your world, Sasha, JPAL and IPA, publish all their results. So you can go look at that for the MIT's JPAL and at IPA's website, which is associated with Yale. But that's just on the heavy gold standard side. All the other fun stuff, no, there's no repository that's got all of the internet.
Do you mean for any type
Just in
of
terms
this?
of like for the general public to or even sort of organizations to wrap their head around this and to help designers understand it more and see the impact. For companies that aren't ripe for it, they're starting to think about how this might help their process, but seeing in the success of it.
I can only speak to the public sector context, where in the United States there's very, very little, because most of the design work which is happening inside of public agencies is being done under non-disclosure agreements, which is really problematic. So I would say look abroad. Like there's a lot more effort to do public sector design work and less anxiety about talking about it in Europe than there is here. Australia also.
Just to add to that, we're from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Design Program. We're working with the UK Design Council. They're actually Europe is designing this whole incredible database of this repository, and we're going to be contributing at least the stuff that we have to that, and that will be, it's not up yet, but in the next 6 to 10 months there'll be a lot of new stuff.
What's the name of that?
I just know it's called the Europe Design Repository. It'll have some much fancier name at some point. But I'm talking to him about it next week, so it's in the works.
Someone could usefully file a bunch of FOIL requests to make a bunch of agencies actually disclose the design artifacts which have been generated for them by a whole range of design firms. Like, there's work that I've done that I cannot legally share with you, but someone could FOIL it, and then presumably it would have to be shown.
But Rachel, you had mentioned before this idea that New York City Department of Health actually has a lot of its data online that anyone can access, and I'm wondering that as well. Are there other sources like that that people could access?
Yeah, well, and I was gonna say, I mean, even like many places when they do evaluations, they like publish, or not publish, but they do a report about it. So when I'm looking for something, for public health, we have a database called PubMed, which is amazing, and there would be design stuff related in there, and you can search and find peer-reviewed articles in there. But even just Google, like if there's some particular topic you're interested in, stuff will most likely come up that's related to what you're looking for, some evaluations that have been done.
So we're going to wrap up, but last question, because we polled a lot of the people who signed up for this to see what their questions were, and the number one question every single person asked was, if I want to know more about impact measurement, what resources do I go to? Where can I look? So I would ask each of you to share just what you think.
I'll go first. So there's actually an American Valuation Association, which is a great resource. It has tons of stuff you can look at on their website. And they actually have a blog, and you can sign up to get an evaluation tip a day in your inbox. It's like AEA 365, and they're really short, and they're great. I've learned from them. I've learned about data visualization from them, and they have links to other resources, and it kind of gives you a sense of like, what are some of the things evaluators are thinking about, and what are some other resources out there.
Could you repeat it? What is it again?
I think it's AEA 365, but if you just Google American Evaluation Association and like, I don't know, poke around their website for the tip a day, eval tip a day. I can send it too to send out to folks.
Specifically on the design front, I would say the Design Council and also Nesta, both of which are organizations in the UK, are probably good places to look for some people who have been thinking about this stuff. The other thing I would really recommend, this is a more complicated undertaking, is partner on some projects with people who are actually trained social scientists. Because designers are not typically trained to do all kinds of things that would be super useful once you find yourself doing this kind of work. Like, I won't even tell you what we just went through trying to figure out how to best and most appropriately get informed consent from people who are jailed when we're trying to do design research with them. Like, that was not a part of my design training. But often social scientists have in fact been taught all sorts of things about research methods, about evaluation methods, so it's very useful to have your multidisciplinary team include people with a really strong grounding in social science methods.
We have a website, it's plusacumen.org. We have 2 courses that couldn't be better aligned to what we just talked about. One is just an introduction to doing impact, which is all the theory of change stuff that we talked through and how you actually do it. I think it's a 4 or 5 week course, and we have another one, our lean data course, which just went live a week ago, which you can sign up for, which is on the how of everything I just talked about. So it's all there, it's free, you can do it in teams. That would make me really happy.
And I have to say that our Mapping Impact project actually started from the 4 of us on the team taking that course and thinking, we should talk more about this.
Yeah.
Resource.
Yeah?
There's a great website called Animating Democracy, which lists all kinds of resources around evaluation. The way we approach it at the agency when we talk to designers is we want you to be better designers, not to become evaluators. It's like having a good accountant. There is a professionalized field of evaluation. Engage those people at a school or through AEA. But the whole point of it is to make you a better designer. Like it should help you evaluate your project. It's measure what you value and people will value what you measure, whatever those platitudes are. It's like how can you become better at what you do by evaluating towards your goals better? So But I think everybody gets caught up in this, like, I have to understand 100% how to do evaluation. It's like, no, you had to understand how to be a better designer, you know? And like, there is a professional who can do that for you and with you. So hire them or get them to volunteer through a school.
What would the job title be of that, of someone like that?
Evaluator. They're consultants. I mean, I think there's 5,000 members of AEA. So.
The last thing I would add also is look into the field of environmental psychology, which is my background. And environmental psychology, for those who don't know, is a field specifically oriented around understanding the impacts of the built environment, physically, socially, emotionally, psychologically, in a number of different ways. It's a fascinating field, and it's fairly young, but there's a lot of really rich research there. So I wish this could go on because I feel like we're just starting to get into this nice group discussion, but I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So I want to thank our panelists again. Thank you guys so much.
And this is an experiment where subjects are randomly assigned to a treatment group and to a control group, and that control group doesn't get the treatment. So they get maybe a placebo or they get nothing. And this is something we generally associate with clinical drug trials, but it can also be used for research, other kinds of research, and for evaluations. But randomized control trials are really expensive. They are often not possible or even ethical to do. So there's the randomized control trial, but then there's reality, and that's where most public health evaluation falls. And this is quasi-experimental or observational design, sort of loosely called one of those two things. And the main distinction here is that these kinds of designs don't involve this random assignment to a treatment and a control group. And one thing I want to point out is this kind of issue of causation versus association. So it's only with a randomized control trial that we can attribute causation to an intervention. With a quasi-experimental or observational design, because we're not randomly assigning people to those groups, we can't be sure that any changes we see are due to what we did, or they could be due to something else that's going on. So we can never say our intervention caused the changes we see with a quasi-experimental or observational design, but we can say there's an association there, and we can say there's a strong association there. And when we plan these kinds of evaluations, we're really trying to think about how can we show a strong association and make the case that it was our intervention that produced that change and not something else that was going on. So we want to kind of try to plan our evaluation in a way that allows us to rule out alternative explanations for any changes that we see. So one really common strategy here is to use a pre-post design. So this is where we measure outcomes before and after an intervention. It's also really helpful to have a control group. So this will hopefully allow you to be able to say, look, we saw these changes in our intervention group, but not our control group. So that helps us make the case that it was our intervention that produced those changes. But these kinds of designs aren't always feasible, they're not always appropriate, and there are a lot of other options as well. One thing that's really important, or not important, but helpful when you're planning an evaluation is to use multiple strategies so that when you're looking at all of your data, you have different sources of data that you can look at to try to understand what's going on. So another part of evaluation design is data collection, and this is obviously really key. You need to think about who's going to comprise your sample, how are you going to collect the data, are you going to do surveys, observations, use secondary data like the census, use qualitative methods like focus groups. And once you collect your data, you have your analysis and interpretation, and I think interpretation where you're kind of looking at your findings and trying to make sense of them. For that piece, it's really important to involve stakeholders. So other people who helped with implementing or carried out the intervention, they should be involved here to help you make sense of what's going on. And then there's dissemination, where you're sharing your findings with others. So I'm going to switch gears for my last few minutes here, since I'm a public health person talking to an audience of designers. I wanted to just talk about some opportunities for collaboration between the public health world and the design world. So one area is active design, and I think there's already a lot of collaboration going on here. And I'll just give a little plug. We have the Fit City conference coming up May 11th, which is all about active design. But I think another area where there's a lot of opportunity is in improving the food environment. So the health department and a lot of other agencies do work with bodegas and supermarkets to get them to carry and promote healthy foods.
Good evening, everybody. We're going to get started. We might have some scragglers come in late, so just be mindful of that. Just want to say thank you so much for coming. We're very excited about this event. We had a really tremendous response, and we're videotaping it because we've had such great response. We have people literally from all over the world, and I say that seriously, who want to hear what this great panel has to say. My name's Mark Randall. I am principal of World Studio and chair of Impact Design for Social Change here at the School of Visual Arts. What was I going to say? Oh, I remember what I was going to say. Okay, so this event is being brought to you by Design Ignites Change, which is an initiative of World Studio and the School of Visual Arts. The summer impact programs here at the School of Visual Arts are now moving into their 6th season. We attract students from all over the world who come to study how they can use design and creativity to impact positive social change. So this event is a really great extension of that program. Tonight's panel is kind of connected to a larger initiative called Mapping Impact. And our moderators this evening, Gilad Marone and Ansley Whipple, are on the organizing committee for this really terrific initiative. So Gilad Marone is a designer, a researcher, and a writer who works with a number of organizations, including the Autodesk Foundation, Enterprise Community Partners, and the Association for Community Design. Ansley Whipple is a great cohort, and we work together at World Studio. She's World Studio's programs director and runs the Design Ignites Change initiative that we have. The Mapping Impact team has been working on this initiative for several months. This is the first of what we hope to be many initiatives around this theme. So I'm going to now stop rambling and turn it over to our moderators to let the show begin.
Thank you, Mark, and welcome everybody. This is an amazing group of people. So just to give some background, over the past 10 to 15 years, there has been a lot of funding and resources devoted to community-based design work. At the same time, we've seen new education programs emerge around the country, such as the Design for Social Innovation program here at SVA. Also, there has been a slew of conferences, events, publications, and exhibitions that highlight this type of work, as well as the emergence of numerous firms and nonprofits practicing in this space. Today, many designers do great work that is creating social impact, but most struggle to provide real evidence for what that impact is or how their designs affect the communities they work with. This is not just a struggle for designers. This is also a major question for funders of this work, as well as students who want to enter this field. But most importantly, this is a real issue for the communities and stakeholders themselves, who have the most to lose in this equation. This boils down to a simple question. How do we know if what we're doing is working? This question is at the core of our research project, and the answer is impact assessment. Impact assessment is a process by which we can work to determine or assess what effects, outcomes, and impacts our work is having. Within the field of social impact design, this means understanding both quantitatively and qualitatively how a community, population, or neighborhood is affected by the actions and interventions of designers and their colleagues. Incorporating impact assessment more rigorously into the design process not only has the potential to strengthen best practices and lead this field towards new insights, but can help us avoid mistakes and failures. While we are not questioning the power design can have to improve the quality of life for many people, too often we've seen misguided projects attempt to help a community in need, only to find that days, months, or years later, the interventions designers implemented actually did more harm than good. We must, at all costs, avoid mistakes such as these that are based in the designer's subjective approach to solving real-world problems, no matter how good their intentions might be. As Ivan Illich once famously said, "To hell with good intentions." Impact assessment points us in a direction away from these failures towards a more evidence-based practice rooted in a deep understanding of the communities we work with. Now, to be sure, we as designers are not pioneers in this area. Impact assessment has been a core part of numerous disciplines for many decades. In particular, fields such as public health, international development, impact investing, economics, and public policy, just to name a few. We as designers are late in the game, and we need to catch up. We can learn from these other disciplines in order to develop legitimate approaches to impact assessment, and also collaborate with fields such as anthropology, environmental psychology, and social work, which play a key role in understanding impact assessment. We hope these conversations continue, and we hope what we discuss here tonight can help build a greater discourse in the design field at large about the importance of impact assessment. Tonight, you might come away with more questions than answers, which is okay because at this stage, we really want to emphasize the importance of asking the right questions. This event is part of an ongoing research initiative to identify and compile toolkits, metrics, best practices, and case studies that can help inform these discussions. This project, which is called Mapping Impact, aims to help build the field of social impact design by connecting design practitioners, students, and researchers with useful tools and resources to better assess the impacts of their work. Please check out our website for more information and news, and we will also be posting a video recording of this event tonight that can be shared easily. I'd like to thank the Impact Design for Social Change program and Design Ignites Change for supporting this event. I would also like to thank our other team members, Katie Corpeau and Kylie Arroyo. Additionally, thanks to our advisors and organizational partners that have helped move this project forward. And now I'm going to let Glad introduce the panelists.
Thank you. So we brought together three amazing panelists from three different fields, and they're going to each share with us their approach to impact assessment and how impact assessment is incorporated into their work and what we can learn from that. So each panelist is going to come up and give a short introduction to their work and their process, and following that we'll have a conversation, and then at the end we'll have some time for questions and answers from the audience. I'd like to introduce our three panelists and ask them each to come up and speak. But before I do, I just want to apologize. Our fourth panelist, which we had listed, Robert Fabricant, was not able to make it tonight. He unfortunately had an unexpected work assignment in Nigeria and had to leave immediately. But that being said, we still have three amazing panelists. So our first panelist, Rachel Danifer, conducts evaluation and research related to food and nutrition at the New York City Health Department's Bureau of Chronic Disease Prevention and Tobacco Control. This agency and bureau are noted as being amongst the premier sources of both innovative and evidence-based public health policy and programs to improve the environment in which New Yorkers live. Rachel's conducted a range of research projects designed to understand the food environment and has led several evaluations to assess the effectiveness of programs to improve access to healthy foods and provide nutrition education to low-income New Yorkers. Please join me in welcoming Rachel.
So thanks so much for that introduction. And I thought first, since I'm coming from the public health world, which sort of feels like a different universe from the design world, I would just spend a minute talking about the New York City Health Department. So the Health Department is actually a really huge agency. Around 5,000 people work there. And I'm in the Bureau of Chronic Disease Prevention and Tobacco Control. And this bureau focuses on developing policies and programs related to healthy eating, active living, and tobacco control in order to address chronic diseases. And those are things like obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. And I'm in the research and evaluation unit in our bureau. And most of my work, as Glad said, is focused on evaluating our healthy eating related programs. So for the rest of my presentation, I'm going to give a broad overview of how we approach evaluation in public health. And I thought first it would be helpful to just talk about why we even do evaluation in the first place. And this was touched on it in the introduction, but I think the most common reason is that we want to know if an intervention is working. And by intervention, I mean a policy, program, a media campaign, a building, or a product you're designing, whatever it is we're doing to intervene on the lives of people. Another really common reason that we do evaluation is to advocate for something. We want data that will help us get more funding for our program or encourage replication. And then another really common reason is that we don't have a choice. So especially if you're doing grant-funded work, funders often require us to evaluate that work. So before you can really plan and carry out an evaluation, you first have to understand what it is you're evaluating. So what is the problem that's being addressed, what resources and strategies will be used to address it, and what's the desired impact. And a tool that we often use to help us do this in public health is called a logic model. And I'm just curious, how many people here have ever heard of a logic model? Okay, so like half of people. All right, so I'm not speaking a completely foreign language. So logic model is basically a visual depiction of your program theory, and it sort of maps out what you hope to achieve and how you plan to do it. And there are a lot of other similar tools out there. A theory of change and a causal pathway are other related tools you might have heard of. So this is an example of a logic model. This is drastically simplified from what we would normally have, but it's easier to present this way. This is for a New York City Health Department program called Come See What's Cooking Kids, which does nutrition education for children in farmers markets that serve low-income communities. So starting at the left, the first column is for inputs, and these are the resources that go into a program. And in this case, the inputs are nutrition curriculum, coupons for local produce, and staff. The next column is the activities that are carried out by the program. In this case, these are leading nutrition classes at farmers markets and distributing coupons to participants so that they can buy produce. The outputs come next, and these are the direct products of those activities. So for this program, the outputs are that participants receive nutrition information and they receive coupons for produce. And then next, with this big box at the right, we have our outcomes. And these are basically the changes that are produced by the program, or that we hope will be produced by the program. And we typically divide these into short-term, intermediate, and long-term outcomes. Short-term outcomes for this program are increased knowledge and improved attitudes around eating produce and nutrition, increased purchasing power so that people can buy more produce, and then intermediate outcomes are increased fruit and vegetable consumption, and the long-term outcome is decreased risk of heart disease. So one thing that's really key in this process, and I actually think it's a common challenge for people, is to make sure that it's reasonable to expect your strategies to lead to your identified outcomes. So for example, just increasing fruit and vegetable consumption alone doesn't actually lead to weight loss. So if we were planning a program that was focused on fruit and vegetable consumption, we wouldn't want to have reduced obesity rates as our long-term outcome, because we would probably never actually show that outcome with our intervention. And if you think about the logic model that I just had up there, that weight loss or obesity rates wasn't up there. But how do you know? How do you know what's reasonable to expect? So for us in public health, a really important resource is peer-reviewed literature. And this basically means articles that are published in academic journals that have been through a rigorous review process. Another important resource is experiential or practice-based knowledge, theory, and expert input. So getting into evaluation planning, I first just want to acknowledge that there are many different types of evaluation. For example, process evaluation is really common, and this is where you're making sure that a program has been implemented the way it was intended to be. But for today, when we're talking about impact, we're really talking about outcome evaluation. And this is where we're trying to measure the change produced by a program or some other intervention. And there are a lot of other terms that get at the same idea, including impact assessment, impact evaluation, effectiveness evaluation, and there are even more, but they're all basically getting at the same idea. So when you're planning an evaluation, one thing you generally do early on is establish your overarching evaluation questions. These should be informed by the goals of the intervention, and they're the key questions that you're going to be trying to answer through your evaluation. You also need to think about what's realistic when you're figuring these questions out. So how far out can you measure your outcomes or impact? Can you focus on a long-term outcome like decreased risk of heart disease, or do you really need to focus on the short-term and intermediate outcomes? And in public health, that's often where we focus, because it would take years for us to measure the long-term impact. Another important thing to consider is what are your resources? How much money do you have? Because that's also going to affect the kind of question that you can answer. So getting into evaluation design, the gold standard here is a randomized control trial.